On behalf of the Patient Safety Authority, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Hot Topics in Pressure Injuries and Wounds. My name is Susan Wallace, and I will be your moderator for this program. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for the webinar. Dr. Diane Krasner is a board-certified wound nurse with over 35 years of experience in wound, ostomy, and incontinence care across the continuum of care. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing and a master of the American Professional Wound Care Association. Dr. Krasner is a wound and skin care consultant and expert witness. She is an adjunct clinical faculty member at Harrisburg Area Community College, York Campus-Nursing program. Dr. Krasner, I will now turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to the Patient Safety Authority for the opportunity to present this webinar today. So here are my objectives for today's presentation. I hope by the end of this time you'll be able to identify at least 3 new and notable terms, guidelines, consensus documents, or position papers in wound care, to discuss COVID skin and wound assessment documentation, and to analyze the current state of the science related to end-of-life wounds. Tomorrow is Worldwide Pressure Injury Prevention Day. So I hope you'll be able to be inspired by this presentation today and share some of this new information with your wound colleagues. Also, I just got an email from NPIAP announcing that they've got many resources available for free on their website. So if you want to scramble and do something for tomorrow, there are quizzes, there are tools, games, and other things that you can get on the NPIAP's website. So just to get us started, I want to give you a little short story about a typical pressure injury case. I do expert work, a lot of that here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and one of the typical cases that comes to court is an elderly patient with multiple risk factors, comorbidities, and conditions. Often they've had a precipitating event like a stroke or a fall that then may end up in the development of a pressure injury. And that is usually a deep tissue injury, stage 3 or 4 pressure injury, a serious full thickness wound that often then occurs simultaneously with other end-of-life symptoms. And you see this kind of downward spiral in the patient. So the key question is this avoidable or unavoidable? And we'll be looking at those issues and those terms and a little bit later in this presentation. So I am the co-editor of Chronic Wound Care. The Essentials version, an ebook edition, came out in 2018, and you have a link to download that. My publisher has made it available to all the attendees of today's webinar. So feel free to download that book and to share it with your colleagues. A couple of my disclosures for this talk. I did co-chair the Skin Changes at Life's End or SCALE panel, which we'll be talking about later. I served on the NPIAP. I'm a WOCN society member, and I do expert witness for both defense and plaintiffs. So I divided this talk into 2 parts. In the first part, we're going to talk about new and notable terminology, guidelines, and consensus documents and some position papers. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to address 3 really hot issues in wound and skin care. So this first part on new and notable terminology, guidelines, et cetera, may be well known to some of you who are on the call who are experts in wound care. So bear with me as I review some of the latest documents for the generalists who may not be so familiar with these documents. I've seen the registration for today's webinar, and I know that we are an incredibly diverse group, from wound specialists to generalists. There are C-suite people, safety officers, risk management, industry people, and we even have some international attendees. So welcome to everybody. I'll try to give a little bit of something for everybody, but experts, bear with me as I review some of the things that have happened mostly in the last year or two in terms of terminology. I think it's important that we're all on the same page. So the first and biggest change happened a couple of years ago when the MPIAP decided to change terminology here in the United States from pressure ulcer to pressure injury. Other countries have not followed suit, but certainly in the U.S., the change has been made. And the rationale for that was the fact that the new term reflects the fact that stage 1 deep tissue injuries and SCARs aren't really ulcerations. They are, skin is intact, and so pressure injury, it was argued, is more reflects the real anatomy and physiology. So as of November of last year, NPUAP changed its name to NPIAP and has a new website that's here that you can go to, where the new definitions, illustrations, and additional resources are listed. And the take-home message, of course, is that at some point you need to change your guidelines to reflect that new terminology. Deep tissue injury moved from being called suspected deep tissue injury now to deep tissue injury or deep tissue pressure injury. And it, of course, differs from a classic pressure injury in that it's an inside-out phenomena, not an outside-in. And it's often seen first as a maroon red skin change that rapidly evolves into a stage 3 or 4 pressure injury. We know much more than we did about DTI a few years ago, but there's still a lot that we don't know. And so as of now, there are no evidence-based interventions for preventing the evolution of a deep tissue injury. A small percentage of DTIs resolve on their own, but the majority of them evolve into full thickness wounds. So another area that has kind of really exploded over the past year is medical device-related pressure injury and our understanding of how prevalent it is. So there are several documents that you see referenced in the next couple of slides dealing with medical device-related pressure injury, and we now know that they account for up to 40% of pressure injuries, and in some high-risk populations, such as neonatal and intensive care, they can account for as much as 50% of pressure injuries. And of course, COVID has made this even worse, and I'll speak to that in a moment. Prevention is the key, but some medical device-related pressure injuries may not be avoidable, even with preventive interventions, because the device is required for sustaining life. So good documentation is key. A subset of those medical device-related pressure injuries have to do with incontinence management. These are mostly preventable and have to do with indwelling catheters and such. So the debate that's gone on for the last decade in wound care is whether certain wounds are avoidable versus unavoidable. And it was CMS that first defined those terms in their guidance for surveyors for long-term care facilities that first came out in 2004. NPUAP extended those definitions to across the continuum of care not just to long-term care facilities in their publications starting in 2011. So if you're not familiar with these documents, you need to be. And there are three, in my view, there are three key documents that everybody should have looked at and be aware of. One was the first one that was published by Joyce Black et al. Reviewed the first consensus conference on this issue, and that was published in 2011, as you see below. The second was published after the second consensus conference in 2013, and then this was published in 2014 by Dr. Edsberg et al. And then the WOCN Society published a position paper on avoidable versus unavoidable pressure injuries, and that was published in 2017. So these are key documents that you and your staff should be aware of. My interest, my personal interest, has been the subset of unavoidable wounds that occur at end of life or with terminal illness. And here you see some examples, end-of-life pressure ulcer on the left, an ischemic wound in a patient who refused to have surgery, and a fungating uterine carcinoma. All of these good examples of unavoidable wounds that palliative wound care would be appropriate for. Another example of a chronic wound which was actually a malignancy when it was biopsied. And, you know, we do palliative wound care on these patients, but that doesn't mean we give up and we don't give them the best of care. Here, to minimize pain and dressing changes, we used a soft silicone foam border dressing for exudate management and pain control. So he had the best of care, but it was a palliative pathway because we didn't have a healed wound as our outcome objective. So last, I just want to mention in this beginning section, the newly released EPUAP, NPIAP, PPIA guideline that came out at the end of last year that is available through the NPIAP website. And this is the one that as you revise guidelines in your facilities, you should be referencing the new guideline. So just some take-home messages for practice on this session. Remember to develop facility guidelines. Don't call them policies and procedures. That's not the best preventive legal care, and we can talk a little bit more on that later. Update your guidelines to reflect the new terminology that we've just discussed and the new practice guidelines, and be sure your guideline references are up to date. So now I'd like to say a few things about COVID skin and wounds. So with the COVID pandemic, we've seen unusual rashes and skin conditions. Here you see two examples of what are being called COVID toes that probably relate to clots or maybe some perfusion issues, ischemia. The complete etiology isn't really understood. COVID rashes that are seen in patients with active COVID disease. And so there's also pressure injury, of course, during this time, and clinicians are reporting increased incidence of pressure ulcers in COVID patients and maybe an increase in deep tissue injury, but there's still a lot to be learned, and we have more questions than answers, and it's not always apparent whether you're looking at a pressure injury or a COVID wound. The NPUAP has published a position document on COVID pressure injury. I urge you to take a look at that if you haven't seen it. Also in the latest issues of the Journal of the WCN and in a special issue of the WCET Journal, there are a number of articles specific to COVID wounds and PPE-related wounds. So it's an area that we need to be very, very focused on at this time. There's also this wonderful document from the Canadian wound nurses, the Nurses Specialized in Wound Ostomy Continence Canada. And you can download this for free from their website. It's got guidance and then protocols and excellent pictures for skin damage related to PPE. It's the best of those documents that I've seen. So a few take-home messages here. COVID is presenting new skin and wound challenges. So keep up with the emerging literature. You know, it's really not clear whether these wounds are ischemic or whether they're really related to thrombi, clots that are forming in these patients. The suggestion is that if it's not on a pressure ulcer, if it's a DTI-looking wound, but not on a bony prominence like a pressure ulcer, that it's likely a COVID wound, not a deep tissue injury. And so you may document it as a suspected COVID wound or COVID-related skin manifestation rather than calling it a pressure injury in a patient with active COVID. It's important to make sure the members of your wound team are up to date with the COVID skin and wound literature as well. And if you're not sure about the etiology, which is okay because there's so much that we don't know right now, get a consult. Get a derm consult, get a vascular consult, because I know from sources here in the state that COVID-related wound litigation is already starting to occur. And so we need to be cautious and we need to do good interventions. Of course, we're not sure what those interventions are if we're not sure what the underlying disease is. So the best is to call on your resources, document carefully, document what you see, and put those differential diagnoses out there. But if you don't think it's a pressure ulcer in a COVID patient, don't call it pressure ulcer until we have more understanding of all of these challenging issues. So now in part 2, I'm going to focus on some of the hot issues in pressure injuries and wounds, and I'm going to look at 3 of them. And please, if you have questions, jot them down, put them in the chat box, and we'll try to address these at the end of my time. So the first issue is wound and skin litigation, which appears to be rampant in the United States and in Pennsylvania. Pressure ulcer litigation from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and everywhere in between. I've been working as an expert witness for about 13 years now, and I can tell just from the number of calls that I get from attorneys that there's much more litigation than there was when I started working as an expert 13 years ago. It's hard to really know the true numbers because the vast majority of cases settled. It's been estimated that 95 to 90%, 97% of wound cases settle. But it's really hard to know the true numbers. the AHRQ estimated a couple of years ago that there were more than 17,000 lawsuits related to pressure injuries annually, with the average claim cost of a pressure ulcer wound claim at $251,000. But it's not uncommon for damages to exceed the tens of millions of dollars. And because we don't have a cap on injuries here in Pennsylvania, that's one of the reasons we've had so much litigation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that I think that you can minimize your risk of litigation. But I also recommend that you take a look at this book by a lawyer in Texas. His name is Kevin Yankowski. He does a lot of wound litigation, and he wrote this book, Preventative Legal Care, A Practitioner's Guide to Medical Legal Fitness. It's not available on Amazon, but it's available from Best Publishing Company that publishes a lot of hyperbaric and wound books. And I think it's a great starting point for wound teams and others to reflect on how they can prevent pressure injury litigation. We spent a ton of time talking about preventing pressure ulcers, pressure injuries, and I think it behooves everybody to spend a little time thinking about how to prevent pressure injury litigation, because when a facility is sued, it's not pleasant, and it's stressful for the practitioners. These cases can drag on for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and so better to avoid them if you can. And I'll make some suggestions on how I think you can do that. But it's a topic that it's expensive when you're sued, and there are system changes that can be made that can help you avoid this litigation. One of the things that I've seen is that the wound and skin cases in Pennsylvania are becoming more and more complex. And in part it's because we have more complex patients with challenging wounds. But there are always nutrition issues involved. There are often incontinence issues involved. And multiple healthcare professionals can be involved, not just the wound nurse and the physician wound person, but the dietitians get dragged in, the therapies get dragged in, and then when it becomes a legal case, multiple experts get involved. So you might have a wound nurse expert involved, a wound physician expert involved, a dietitian expert opining on the nutrition, the therapies involved, and that's on each side. So these cases become very complicated, multiple experts opining, lots of depositions, and lots of money involved. There are also multiple co-defendants. So, the day of just one facility being sued for a pressure injury case are pretty much over. So now you have the hospital, the nursing home, the wound home care, the hospice. You may have as many as 7 co-defendants in one case with multiple lawyers and multiple experts. And it's not just the facilities that are being sued. I have seen in Pennsylvania not only wound nurses and wound physicians named as defendants, but also LPNs and even some nurse aides. So it's just gotten so complicated and it's so burdensome. So the best thing is to try to prevent these lawsuits from happening if we can. And the best things we can do are document, get consults, and if we suspect that there might be an unhappy family in litigation to let our colleagues in risk management and the safety officers know what might be coming down the pike. So the second issue I'd like to talk about relates to end-of-life wounds. And there are 4 current terms in use, although the first discussion of end-of-life wounds happened way back in the 1800s when Jean-Martin Charcot of the Charcot foot fame first talked about the decubitus ominosus. And he made the observations back in the 1870s that he saw pressure ulcers in dying patients, and he called them the decubitus ominosus because they were ominous of death. About 120 years later, my colleague and good friend Karen Lou Kennedy Evans observed what she termed the Kennedy terminal ulcer at her nursing home. She began tracking these lesions, and they were butterfly-shaped sacral lesions and usually appeared days to a couple of weeks before a person died. And she published her work in 1998, something like that. And other terms have since been put forth. The scale panel that I co-chaired with Dr. Gary Sibbles from Canada, we spoke about a range of skin changes that can occur at the end of life and published a consensus document on that in 2009. More recently, there's been discussion of skin failure, which was first, the term was first put out there by Brown and Langamo, and has been divided into acute, chronic, and terminal skin failure. And finally, most recently, Trombley and Brennan in New York have proposed a lesion that they call Trombley-Brennan terminal tissue injury. So while we don't agree yet on terminology, there is agreement that certain lesions occur in patients who are dying that we need to be cognizant of. So here's from the scale panel the range of skin changes you might see at life's end in dying patients, from modeling on the upper left through, if you look at that third picture on the top, that's a Kennedy terminal ulcer, butterfly-shaped sacral lesion, to cancer-related wounds, ischemic-related wounds that you see on the bottom, and finally, a fungating uterine carcinoma. So there is a diverse range of skin changes at life's end that for which we need to be developing palliative care plans from our palliative pathways if we have them in our wound care guidelines. You can download many of the scale documents, some PowerPoint presentations that I've done, and our complete bibliography from my website, which is www.dianelkrasner.com. So in 2020, in February, right before the COVID lockdown, the last meeting I went to was actually an MPIAP meeting looking, among other things, at these 4 concepts and trying to see if we could come to consensus on a term, because everybody agrees that if we had one term, it would make life easier for everybody. So the 4 concepts were considered, and a formal concept analysis was undertaken prior to the meeting and reported on at this meeting by the MPIAP. And they reached the conclusion that the concepts are, in fact, different and that more research is needed before we're at a point where we can pick one. So there was agreement that end-of-life wounds occur, but there was no consensus on terminology. And as much as we wanted to reach the end of this discussion, it is to be continued. So where are we today? Well, my feeling is that we've got lots of pieces of a puzzle. But we can't see the whole picture yet. We know that certain things happen, but we don't understand all the etiologies and pathologies that cause them. And so we just haven't been able to come up with a term yet that covers all the bases of what we're seeing in clinical practice. And it reminds me always of my favorite quote. There are two things I want to tell you about first. So one is that, and I just participated in this, and it's very exciting. So in order to do more research on the subject, we need to collect data. And in order to collect data, we need to have some tools for that. So Dr. Sharon Latimer and her team in Queensland, Australia at Griffith University are currently working on the development of an end-of-life wound assessment tool. And she just completed round 2 of a Delphi that they're using for this tool development. Originally, it was called the Terminal Ulcer tool, but now she changed in the second round to end-of-life wound assessment tool. And hopefully that will be released within the next year so that people can actually collect data on end-of-life wounds, and then we can do some more research that will help us reach consensus. Latimer published this wonderful scoping review of Kennedy terminal ulcers that was published in the Journal of Hospice and Palliative Nursing that you might want to take a look at. And then just a couple of weeks ago, Richard Hill and Amy Peterson from Louisiana published their tool that they've worked on for skin failure. It's called the Skin Failure Clinical Indicator Scale, a tool for distinguishing skin failure from pressure injury. So these are very positive signs for us going forward because they'll help us to do some more descriptive research so that we can really land on a term or make decisions, and from there we can help our colleagues to document. We can hopefully make some changes in terms of regulations and regulatory related to these end-of-life wounds. So here's my favorite quote, summary for this where we are with this. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. So if it was easy, we would have figured this out a long time ago. It's challenging because there's so much we still don't know about these end-of-life wounds. And so thank you, Mencken, for that. So my final thought about end-of-life wounds is that it's important that we develop goals of care and plans of care and interventions with unavoidable end-of-life wounds in mind. And our documentation of outcomes must address these end-of-life wounds. We need to advise families patients, families, and caregivers that, this might be an end-of-life wound, that it was unavoidable, that it probably won't heal, whatever term you choose to use. But if we do a better job at addressing the goals for those patients, that being not necessarily to heal the wound, but to address pain and suffering and odor control and exudate management, and that our plans of care and interventions reflect those end-of-life outcomes, that palliative wound care. My belief is that the litigation in this area will decrease. Many of the cases that I'm asked to review here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania are end-of-life wounds. And I think that we need to do a better job in explaining to patients, if they're able to understand, and to their families about what's really happening, and why we may be meeting the standard of care and the care we do, but the patient is no longer healable. So the goal should be to minimize pain and suffering in skin and wound patients at the end of life. So the last issue that I want to talk about is negative pressure wound therapy and the challenges that continue with litigation in this arena. As we use more and more negative pressure wound therapy, we see more and more retained foam or gauze cases. And then I've seen recently some very interesting cases related to missing pumps or delays in initiating or continuing negative pressure wound therapy as the patients move across the continuum of care. And clinicians, we know these challenges, and coordination is just one of the hardest things for us to do in our complex system. So the legal arena has an expression for these kind of cases, the retained foam or gauze cases. It's res ipsa loquitur, Latin for the thing speaks for itself. So if there's a patient who has a retained FAC sponge, negative pressure wound therapy sponge, somebody must have done something wrong, because otherwise the retained foam wouldn't be there, or the retained gauze. So these cases are hard to defend, and some of the issues that come up when these cases go to court are the following. So keep these in mind and make sure that you are addressing them in your facilities. First is, do you have a clear protocol guidelines for use of negative pressure wound therapy that identifies things like marking the number of pieces of foam that are in the wound, on the drape, on the Cardex, by verbal communication? That documentation is critical if you're using multiple pieces of foam. Has everybody who's a prescriber of negative pressure been trained? And then has everybody who's a user been trained? Those are easy legal preventive things that can be done system-wide. Those are the kind of system changes that can help you decrease your risk for litigation in this area. So the issue of missing pumps or delay in initiating therapy goes to how you're coordinating across the continuum of care, how you're assuring that your patient has the pump they need at their next location, and that if they're going into home care visits are being coordinated timely so that the dressing changes are done timely, the equipment is there, and it's a lot of detail, and the devil's in the detail. So there are ways to avoid problems by getting discharge planning involved right away, by using single-use pumps if you can do that, so that you don't have to worry about pump delivery in another setting. And again, assuring that the patients, the family, and caregivers have been educated. And there are great tools from the companies for doing that. You just have to make sure that the family and caregivers get those videos and get those tools so that they can be prepared when the negative pressure wound therapy patient moves to another setting. So you can't always avoid using a large pump or using multiple pieces of foam. That's not always an option. On the patient on the left, her dehisced wound was so deep that I had to layer 3 layers of foam to fill that void. So, and then you can see the other pieces marked. There was a bridge for that patient on the top left who was a complex necrotizing fasciitis patient and had two wounds that we connected to one pump. So there were multiple pieces of foam. There was no way to avoid that. So then you have to make sure that you document that. Some of the litigation that I've been involved in where patients were transferred from one facility to another where the foam dressing was still left in, and it was a quick transport from one facility to another, but then the providers in the new facility didn't know how many pieces of foam were in that original wound, and foam got left behind, and then usually it's some period of time the wound heals over the retained foam. That might be in a tunnel or a track, and then 6 months to a year later, they've got wound problems. They go back in, they do a biopsy, and they find retained foam. So res ipsa loquitur. Somebody somewhere did something wrong if there's a retained foam there. So there are some efforts being made now to develop X-ray detectable foam, and that would be a good thing. But still, making sure that you have guidelines in place and that you've trained your staff can help you avoid these kinds of problems. So here are some take-home messages for practice on this second half. Wound and skin litigation is rampant in Pennsylvania. Practice preventive legal care. Make sure you address end-of-life wound care in your facility. And make sure you have clear, up-to-date guidelines for use of negative pressure wound therapy and that your prescribers, providers, and staff are trained in negative pressure wound therapy. So remember, tomorrow's a day to mobilize your wound team and your staff. Use the opportunity to highlight pressure injury prevention and go to MPIAP for some teaching tools and things that you can use tomorrow to celebrate. And with that, I'm going to end a little bit early. More time for questions. If you have questions for me that we don't get to today or things that you don't want to say on this call, feel free to go to my website, and you can contact me through my website, and you can also download scale-related documents there, and also some of my work that I did on wound pain is available there on my website. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Susan to moderate a Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Krasner. That was some great information. And that concludes the slide presentation portion of our program. And as Dr. Krasner said, we'd like to begin our question and answer period. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. Please click on the 3 dots. You'll see them at the bottom of your screen to open the Q&A panel, and then direct your questions to all panelists, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can. We actually do have already a few questions here, Dr. Krasner, so I'm going to just read them off. Some of them might be a duplicate, but we can go through them. So our first question is, do you have an example of an end-of-life wound care plan with interventions? I guess the person is asking if you have one that you could share.
Well, when I first came to York and worked at Rest Haven in York, we developed one at our facility. So we had, for our pressure ulcer protocol, we had stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and palliative. It's somewhat out of date, however, because that was 20 years ago. So I think that there's a great article that I wrote with my mentee as the lead author, Dr. Kevin Wu from Canada, on palliative wound care. And that has great materials that you can pull to develop an end-of-life wound care plan for in your facility format. So, Susan, could I make that PDF available to you, and could you post it somewhere so people could look at it?
Yes.
Okay, I'll do that, Shelley. I'll do that, or and I'll see if I can put it up on my. It may already be up there on my website, but if not, I'll see if I can get it up there as well.
Okay, great. That'll be wonderful. Our next question is along the same lines, but can you discuss some issues with quality reporting of end-of-life and unavoidable pressure injuries in the acute care setting? I know you went over some of that, but if you had something you can discuss a little bit more with the type of reporting.
Well, so, you know, it's one of the things that's difficult and is part of the argument that we have over terminology is, you know, can you say that it's an end-of-life wound before the person has died? And my argument is that, you know, we have to do this often. We put patients on hospice and say that it's usually the physician decision that say that the patient probably has 6 months, 3 months to live and is a candidate for hospice. And so we could say the same thing for wounds, that this is probably an end-of-life wound, but we don't know for sure that the patient's going to die. And there are, in fact, some patients who are palliative who live, and there are some wounds that look to be end-of-life wounds that go on to heal. But, you know, the vast majority of them don't go on to heal because the host has so many comorbidities, conditions, and those are the things that one should be addressing in a note. So if you decide that a patient's going to go on palliative care, the reasons are because their nutritional status is compromised, and even though they're getting supplements, they can't absorb those supplements, that they've got long-standing chronic illnesses, that they've got incontinence, all of those risk factors and comorbidities. And when I'm reviewing a legal case, I take that Edspert et al. Document and look at all those risk factors that make a wound unavoidable. And that helps me to do a legal case, but it would also help a clinician document why this wound is probably end of life and probably unavoidable. But what you document in the clinical setting is going to be, in a patient's active chart, is going to be a little bit different than the way I would say it in a expert report down the road when the family sued. There are challenges, though, when it comes to reporting, and reporting in Pennsylvania of a pressure ulcer, because some of these rubrics aren't there for you to choose. So maybe, Susan, you could speak a little bit about how in Pennsylvania you would report an end-of-life pressure injury.
Well, I could only speak to what we have here through the Patient Safety Authority, which is the Pennsylvania Patients Reporting System, PACERS. And we have clear guidance on the information that is reported for end of life in our PA Bulletin final guidance for acute care healthcare facility determinations. And in there, you understand that we're not talking in there about the preventability as much as the fact that these are occurring. So that's the kind of information we're looking here at the authority. It's not a blame. It's not saying anyone caused this injury to occur. It's more a data collection of what is occurring out into our facilities. So what I could do is place in the chat box our final guidance with a web link. So if people would like to look through that, that might be helpful. And so I will paste that in now and send it to everyone. But Dr. Krasner, we do have many more questions for you.
Okay.
And along those same lines, and a question here is, would an end-of-life wound present as a wound only to an area of pressure, such as a heel, or would there be varied wounds and skin issues?
Yeah, so there are many wounds that are not pressure injuries that would be end-of-life wounds. So all those malignant wounds with malignancies in them, fungating wounds, all of these are wounds for which a person should be put on our palliative pathway. And then there are some wounds that transition and become that start out as acute wounds and end up transitioning to become palliative. For example, you might have a fistula that, if you're lucky, spontaneously heals, but if you're unlucky and in the majority and they can't do a surgical repair on you, you may have a fistula in a wound that then becomes an end-of-life fistula wound, where the person can't, it reaches a point where the person is so compromised that it becomes unhealable. So it's the end-of-life wounds are a huge, broad category of skin and wound issues, of which pressure ulcers are only a small percentage, but they're the most talked about because there's so much litigation related to pressure injury.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We do have a question here about writing on the residence dressing, and this person's asking, would it be considered a dignity issue to have the amount of pieces of foam written on the residence dressing? I mean, would you consider that to be a dignity issue?
Well, I suppose some state surveyors might think that it's a dignity issue, but I would make the argument that it is the best way and the most assured way to have that information right there with the dressing with the patient, because you never know when they're going to be moved to another environment or facility, and the communication doesn't go along with the patient. And I've been involved in several lawsuits where that's happened, where they've moved from a SNF to acute care or one acute care facility to another, and that information didn't get transferred with the patient, and that's how a retained foam happened. So I would make my strongest argument that it is for the safety of the patient that information needs to be right on the dressing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it would be a safety issue, and it would be something that would be considered by another healthcare provider if they're looking at that foam. They would know the number of
exactly.
pieces. Yeah,
exactly.
All right.
Because especially, more and more that negative pressure wound therapy dressings are being put on in the operating room, and when that happens, getting that information about, and those wounds are usually deep wounds and have multiple pieces of foam in them. And so how otherwise do you assure that number is going to be communicated either from one place in the hospital to another or to another facility? So I would argue that one till I was blue in my face. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have time we can do at least one more question here. And it's a sort of a very specific question. And this person's asking, we went from a wound vacuum to a silver AG and Prisma on a stage 4. The wound is healing better than when it was in negative pressure. And I guess she's asking, why would some NPWT, I guess negative pressure wound therapies, work on some and not on others?
Well, it's a great question, and, I can only surmise about what happened there. And sometimes it is that using negative pressure for a little while is enough to jumpstart the wound, to get it back into balance, and jumpstart it so that when you stop the negative pressure, it heals better without it. There are negative pressure wound therapy vacations. We know that if you take a break from therapy, that sometimes the wound will just jumpstart after you stop it. So that's a known phenomenon that has to do with the negative pressure wound therapy, which has multiple ways that it affects the wound, that it can just reverse it and sort of jumpstart the wound to healing. There is a wonderful chapter in Chronic Wound Care, The Essentials, written by one of the former medical directors at KCI, and you can read about that if you download the book and take a look at that chapter on negative pressure wound therapy.
Okay, great. So hopefully we've gotten to almost all the questions, and I want to thank everyone, including you, Dr. Krasner, for joining us today. If you experience any issues assessing the evaluation and our Certificate of Continuing Education, please feel free to direct any inquiries to Shelley Meixel at shmixell@pa.gov or contact PSA support staff at 717-346-0469. This concludes our webinar.